Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and this lecture series is on environmental science. So you're going to see a series of lectures, some labs, some demonstrations, all for environmental science. Okay? So with that being stated, we're going to jump right into this lecture, and this lecture is on the scientific method and really the nature of science. So how do scientists construct experiments, do experiments? Where are the biases? Well, how can you eliminate biases, or at least try to eliminate biases? Okay. So that's where we're going to go with this lecture, and we're going to have some questions embedded in the lecture. If you're taking my course, then you should be answering these questions either in your journal or as assignments. Okay, make sure you're taking notes. That's why they're up there, is so you can take notes on the lectures. Okay. All right. So the nature of science. Here you can see some field research going on. You can see that they're doing some aquatic plant research, and we'll talk more about this in environmental science, the research methodology, and you're going to do some research in environmental science. Okay, so the basic rules of science. Okay, first, couple definitions. I like to give definitions as we go, but obviously you can always come back and review the definitions. Science in itself is kind of the pursuit of evidence, or the pursuit of answers. Okay, and there's lots of different types of science. There's what's typically called hard sciences. This is where you have distinct experiments that follow the scientific method, and often don't involve a lot of human interaction. And these things would be like physics, chemistry, biology, environmental science, zoology, and a lot of other fields. Okay? Those are often called the hard sciences. And then there are sciences that we call the soft sciences. Sometimes they do follow the scientific method, but they often involve studying human interactions or human emotions, or humans are often the focal point of the research. And that would be things like psychology, sociology, even history, and some of the other fields. They're considered soft sciences. Okay, but in general, the purpose is the same purpose, whether we're talking about a hard science or a soft science. The purpose is to gather evidence, okay, analyze the evidence, and make decisions, conclusions, etc., based on that evidence. Okay, so it's the pursuit of answers. Okay. There are four major concepts in that pursuit. Okay, first is the facts. Okay, and people are pretty good about this piece of science. People are pretty good about collecting data. Now, how they collect data might, not be that good or that scientific, but they collect data. So they make observations of events in the world. Okay, that's facts. Okay, or loosely facts. Okay, we'll talk more about what makes something a true fact, or what makes something a biased fact. This is where science really gets separated from a lot of the other fields, and that is creating explanations for natural phenomena. Okay, so a hypothesis is then created. So you gather some facts, okay, you gather some observations, and then you create a hypothesis that explains those observations. Okay? Now, often you'll hear people say a hypothesis is an educated guess. Okay? This is not true. It's not a guess at all. Okay? There are ways to create hypotheses, and there are ways to guess, and those two don't really interact. Remember, a hypothesis has to be testable. Okay? A guess doesn't have to be testable, not even remotely, and most guesses are not even testable. Okay? They're just thrown out there. Okay? Hypotheses have to be set up as to you can test that hypothesis, and it has to be an explanation for a natural phenomena. At least in the biology realm, the environmental science realm, it's an observation of a natural phenomena. So things like ghosts and spirit world and things like that, that's not natural phenomena. So environmental science doesn't, and biology doesn't, create hypotheses about those features. Okay? So, testable explanation for a natural phenomena. Okay? From there, you're going to create experiments, you're going to test that hypothesis. If that hypothesis is supported by the experiments, by the evidence from those experiments and the data analysis, then if you combine a bunch of hypotheses, okay, and they've been tested for a very long time and they're still in support of the original hypothesis or multiple hypotheses, okay, then it can be elevated to what we call a theory. Okay? And there are lots of theories, okay, and we'll talk about theories like, the theory of natural selection, the germ theory. We'll talk about the theory of disease. We'll talk about lots of these theories out there. And most people, this is where they get confused, because the word theory to lay people or the general public means guess. Right? So you'll often hear students talk in the hallways and, oh yeah, I got a theory about that. Well, in actuality, you have a guess about that. Okay? It's not a theory. A theory to a scientist means you've already guessed with a testable hypothesis. You've already tested it multiple times and supported it multiple times in multiple ways, and now you have yourself an explanation, an accepted explanation for that natural phenomenon. That's what a theory is. It's been accepted, it's been tested, and that is the explanation for that natural phenomena. Okay? From there, we can describe that theory as a law. So if that theory is constant and doesn't change, then it's considered a law. And here's where science is kind of divided. And it's only divided because of the way the hard sciences work. Okay? So in chemistry and physics, you're going to learn about laws. There's lots of laws in those subject areas. Okay? In biology, there are very few laws. Okay? And the laws that we have in biology are often really just dedicated to mathematical principles, like Mendelian genetics. There are a couple laws in genetics, but it's based purely on probability. Okay? And so those are laws that come from mathematics. They don't change, they're constant. The reason why things like the theory of evolution is not the law of evolution is not because that it's not supported and that it's not important enough to be a law. And in fact, it probably is a law. But the thing about biology that makes it so unique, and this is where environmental science gets stuck in, because environmental science is examining biology of the natural world. Okay? This is what makes it so unique, is that biology is always changing because of evolution. So because biology is always changing, that's why we don't elevate things like the germ theory, the theory of disease, the theory of evolution, okay? The cell theory. Okay? All of these are actually constant in their explanation for natural phenomena. Okay? But because they have the opportunity to change, because biology is the study of life and life is always changing, we don't elevate them to laws. Okay? So when you think about things that we go over in environmental science, and you think about when I say, oh yeah, this is the theory of disease, because we'll talk about diseases because it's very important for environmental science, human populations, and disease transfer, things like that. We'll talk about the theory of disease. I don't want you to think, oh, well, it's just a theory. Okay? That theory is still supported by massive amounts of evidence. Okay? And it is the accepted explanation for how diseases are transferred. Okay? So we'll come back to this as we progress. Okay? So let's look at some things that are not science. Okay? And we call things that are not science but try to act like science pseudoscience. Okay? Pseudoscience is often beliefs or claims that are scientific, okay? But they don't follow the scientific principles, or they can't follow the scientific principles because it's not possible to test. Okay, so some of you might watch TV shows about ghosts and spirit hunters and things like that, and they might claim that this is a scientific evidence that these ghosts and spirits are around. However, because it's not reproducible, because you can't devise an experiment and have that experiment work every single time, it violates the scientific principle, therefore it's pseudoscience. Okay? It's not scientific. Okay? That does not mean that it couldn't be real, or it doesn't mean that you couldn't in the future devise something that would make it be scientific. Okay? So there's lots of things that were considered pseudoscience, okay, in the 1800s and the 1700s that are now scientifically supported because now we have the ability to test that. Okay? For example, in the early 1800s, we had no clue how genetics, which we didn't even know it was called genetics, but how one offspring would get traits of both parents. We didn't know this. Okay? And there were a lot of explanations put out by many different groups of people, scientists, mathematicians, religious individuals, okay? And they all explained it in different ways. Well, at first, every single one of those is pseudoscience because none of them could test it. Because genetics, genes, chromosomes hadn't been discovered. And so there was no testable way, so they're really all just claims to be scientific and claims to know the answer, but in fact, none of them knew the answer. Okay, and we'll come back to that as we progress. Okay, so again, pseudoscience. The claim itself is not repeatable or reproducible. Okay? The claim has no experimental evidence. Okay? No alternative explanations for the claim have ever been tested. Okay? So there are a whole slew of things that pseudoscience violates the scientific process. Okay, and we're going to talk about some of these pseudosciences and how as time has gone by, we've been able to debunk or remove these as scientific explanations. Okay, and they're all over in different fields. Okay, but we're going to concentrate on a few of them. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is this thought of spontaneous generation. Okay, so spontaneous generation was thought for a very long time, even into the 1800s, mid 1800s, and probably even into the early 1900s. There were still individuals that believed that matter could arise from non-living matter, that it just spontaneously generates. In some explanations, it was that a higher being, i.e. God, would just make them poof into existence. In other explanations, it was that, they just came out of nothing, okay? That there wasn't a higher being doing it. It's just that's how the world worked. Things came from nothing, okay? And often it was around these mysteries that we couldn't solve because we didn't have the technology to do that. So it was based purely on observations, which people thought were facts. But they weren't facts because they were very limited. So you might have, a pile of animal dung, animal feces, okay, sitting there, and if you're watching it for a long period of time, all of a sudden there's beetles that crawl out of it, right? Adult beetles that crawl out of it. And people would say, oh yeah, that's spontaneous generation. Those beetles came from nothing. When in fact, the eggs were laid in that dung, the eggs hatched inside of it, the larvae ate on it, and then the larvae would crawl out and become adult beetles. Okay? And this is a life cycle thing, but we didn't have the capability of seeing the very, very minute little teeny eggs. Okay? So we thought during this period of time that it was spontaneous generation. Okay, maggots growing on rotting meat, same story. Lots of things. Mice that would get into like jars, or ants that would get into jars of flour or sugar or, rice or grains. And then all of a sudden, you'd open it up and there's mice or ants or little baby beetles crawling out of your food. And, that was, spontaneous generation. Okay, lots of other things like bread sitting on a counter, okay, and mold growing on it, spontaneous generation. How people got sick. So the original theory of disease, how people passed on diseases, okay, was spontaneous generation. And in fact, if you were sick, okay, it was often thought it was a punishment from a god. And so at times there were multiple gods, and then when there was just a single God, regardless of your religion, was punishing you for acts that you did, and that's why you're sick, okay? And it was considered spontaneous generation. Okay, so lots of things. Fleas arising from dust. There's all kinds of examples of spontaneous generation, okay? It's a pseudoscience because there are no alternative explanations that were ever considered, like that there's minute organisms, like if the bread is making mold on it, that there's mold spores floating around in the air that are invisible to the naked eye that could be landing on this. So apart from just being, no alternative explanations, none of these were testable. Okay, people didn't test it. They just assumed that if maggots were growing on the meat, that they would spontaneously be generated on that rotting meat. Okay, and that's, a lot of where the scientific method was never followed. There is no control. There's no set, period of time where you close off that dung and nothing can reach that dung. Okay, or close off that rotting meat and nothing can get in there. Okay, no one ever did any of these experiments There was no test taken. There was no data taken. It was just explained based on a observation. Okay. Along came this man. Okay? This guy is what's often called the father of disease theory, okay? And the major debunker of spontaneous generation. Okay? And his name is Louis Pasteur. You probably know his name because we now consume pasteurized milk. Okay? That was Louis Pasteur's, one of his inventions, creations, whatever you want to call it, was the pasteurization process. Okay, but prior to that, he also created this glassware, which is called Pasteur's glassware. Okay, which these long tubes are connected to it. Okay, but Louis Pasteur was not going to accept spontaneous generation. He was not going to accept that things appear from nothing. Okay, he is contributed to the third tenet of the cell theory, which is all cells arise from other cells. Okay? There is no spontaneous generation. So his experiment goes a little bit like this. You can see the glassware here. He created nutrient broth, okay, so which is just water with some nutrients in it that bacteria and fungi like to grow in. And he'd boil it out to make sure that it was sterile. Okay? And then he would set it on his counter in his laboratory. Okay? And he did this over and over and over again. Okay? And the difference between the two experiments, see, this is where the scientific method comes in. He had a control and then an experimental experiment. Okay? The control had these long tubes of glass, which he assumed if there were particles of bacteria and viruses and fungus floating in the air, they wouldn't be able to go against gravity and make it into the flask. So these would be controls. And he assumed that if they can't get in there, then this beaker should be without bacteria, without fungus, without viruses forever, as long as they couldn't get in. Okay? Air could still get in, but molecules of things couldn't fight gravity and they weren't going to flow up the tube. On the other hand, he broke those off on some of his other beakers. Okay? And he sat them on his shelf, and sure enough, ones that had the long glass tubes never accounted or never accumulated bacteria or viruses or fungi. But the ones with the broken glass, where the air could flow in freely, molecules of bacteria, viruses, fungi could fall into the flask. They had substantial amounts, and they become cloudy with massive amounts of bacteria and fungus and viruses. Okay? And so this experiment then was progressed, and Louis Pasteur, continuously did other experiments, but this famous experiment showed that, hey, diseases, fungus, okay, rotting flesh, these kind of things, it's not spontaneous generation. There are microorganisms. There are small microscopic organisms floating through the air that make us sick, that can pass disease to disease, and you can't track them. You cannot see them with the naked eye. And that's kind of contributed to the disease theory that Louis Pasteur discovered. Okay, so another one, okay? Another pseudoscience. Okay, in early times, it was thought that the planet, that Earth, was composed of only 4 elements. Okay, and these elements are not the elements on the periodic table. Okay, they're just elements as described by scientists at the time, and that would be fire, air, water, and earth. Okay? Due to this, a study or a pseudoscience came about, and that was called alchemy. Okay? And that was being able to transfer substances from one substance to another. So you could make things like lead or steel into gold by manipulating them with the four elements. So either by heating them or by exposing them to air or water or mixing them with earth materials, you could change lead into gold. Or vice versa. If you wanted, lead and you had gold, you could, switch it back to lead. Okay, it's pseudoscience, obviously, because the four-element theory, it was never experimentally tested. Okay, they never would publish their results, so you go to an alchemist and you'd ask them to do this. Sometimes if you gave them gold, they'd be clearly able to give you lead back. Okay, that was easy, If you give them gold, they're going to give you lead because gold was worth way more than lead. If you give them lead, maybe they would manipulate the lead, behind the scene kind of thing, and give you a tiny bit of gold back, just so you believe in the alchemist's results. Okay, but they never shared their results and they wouldn't publish their results, and often they did it behind closed curtains so their art or their science could not be reproduced. In actuality, they were just crooks, and there is no evidence that they could do anything except for take your money or your resources. Okay, so let's look at their claims. Okay, so this is the elemental periodic table. Okay, and we can find gold on the elemental periodic table. It's right here. Okay, so gold is AU. Okay, and then we can jump over a couple and look at lead. Lead is PB. Okay, so let's blow that up so you can check them out. So again, gold is AU, lead is PB. Okay, so here's why, the transfer from gold to lead or lead to gold was definitely not possible at the given time. Okay. Can we do it today? Yeah, we can do it today, but it's very, very difficult. And in fact, it can be extremely expensive and probably not worth it. Okay, so gold has 79 protons in its nucleus. Okay, and we'll come back to this and we'll examine this. Okay, lead has 82 protons in its nucleus. So you can see here that lead, in order to transfer lead into gold, you would have to remove protons from their nucleus. Okay, this is not that easy of thing to do. But on top of removing protons, you also would have to remove neutrons. So you can see that the atomic mass of lead is 207.2. We don't need to ignore the 0.2, but for this demonstration, we're just not going to talk about it. Okay, so if you take 82 from 207, you have 125. That means you have 125 neutrons in the nucleus. Okay, lead has 82 electrons. Okay, so not only are you removing protons, you're also removing electrons and changing the number of neutrons in the nucleus. These are not easy feats to do, and with the technology of earth, fire, air, and water, they are not possible. It's not possible to do it because you need things to bind up. You need things to take those protons and those electrons and those neutrons in order to convert it into gold. Okay? So alchemy was never tested, therefore pseudoscience. And now we know not a science at all. It's fake. Astrology. Okay? A lot of early astrology and even astrology today, okay, was the belief that movement and positions of the stars had an effect on actions in the world, in the natural world. Okay. Now, in some cases, it does. Okay. The position of the moon to Earth, definitely will change behaviors and actions on the planet, like tides and behaviors of animals and things like that. But the positions of far out stars, okay, a little more was believed than, that they could have a minute effect, like the ability for animals to navigate. Okay, that might be possible with the position of stars. We're not entirely sure. We actually believe that most animals navigate by the poles of the planet, the magnetic fields of the planet, rather than examining the stars. But early people who, navigated the oceans and things like that, they definitely examined the stars, and that's how they navigated during nighttime. But astrology itself went further than just navigation. Okay? It went further into being able to predict your behavior or your mood or what's going to happen to you in a given time period, even a given day, maybe a given month, a given week, etc. So zodiac charts were created and horoscopes were created from these. And it all was based on constellations that the sun passed through or passed by in a given day. And there's other ones that maybe it was given time of year. There's different things, okay? But at any rate, astrology, early astrology, and even still today, there's a lot of zodiac charts and individuals that believe in this. Now, I'm not saying that there's no reason to believe in this, but do not call it science because it's not testable. Okay, so the predictions that are provided, they're very generic. They're not scientific. Okay, and you can't support them with scientific evidence. You can't test them. That's why they're so generic. Is interpretation is easily dependent on the individual reading it. Okay. The other thing is the Earth's axis has changed. It's shifted, and it does so often. Okay. And so when the zodiac charts and astrology was first generated and predictions were first generated, okay, things have changed since then. So updates are needed, but then how do you update it given that you have no scientific method to provide? Okay. So this is just kind of what we call a meta-analysis of horoscopes, okay? And so these are the most common words used in 4,000 predictions, okay? So you have 4,000 predictions, and these are the most common words that come up, okay? And you can see that a lot of these are very open, generic terms. Expect nothing else, okay? Keep making love. These are so generic and so open-ended to interpretation that there are still many people that follow this and will read their horoscopes. Some do it as a joke. Some do it because they believe in it. But, life may be hard, okay, or easy. There's lots of situations where these would come in. Okay, the other thing is, there's a bunch of dates here. These are the old dates for the, different signs. These are the new dates for the different signs. Okay? But like I said before, it's really not testable. Okay? There's no experiment, or there has been absolutely no scientific experiment that can demonstrate that a Taurus on one day should experience these feats, okay, or these behaviors or these actions are relevant, okay, and that an Aries on the next day would either have the same or something, similar to that. Okay, there's absolutely no scientific evidence that any of this is scientifically supported. That doesn't mean that you can't read it, you can't believe in it. Okay, just goes to show you that it's not science. Okay, so let's look at the scientific method and why things are considered science and why things are not considered science, like those pseudoscience examples. The scientific method follows the same steps no matter what the topic is. If I'm studying birds, same steps. If I'm studying beetles, same steps. If I'm studying stoichiometry or different types of chemical analysis, same steps. If I'm studying gravity or theory of friction or any other physics examples, same steps. Okay? For that matter, if I'm in psychology and I'm studying emotion or I'm studying other human traits and I'm going to consider it science, same steps. Okay? And those steps are very important that you follow these steps to a T, because they eliminate a lot of the biases, a lot of the mistakes or interpretation mistakes that make us human. Okay? Humans are often want to predict what's going to happen. Okay? That's actually what makes us so unique. Okay? Some people say, well, we're unique because we have really big brains, okay, and we're very smart, and and we have cooperation, and we're social organisms. But there are lots of things that have really big brains, that are really smart, that have cooperation, that can make tools, that have socialization, they talk to each other, that are not human. Okay, there's lots of birds that can do this. There's other primates that can do this. But one thing that really sets humans, Homo sapiens, apart from other animals is our ability to predict the future. And it's not because we do it well. And in some cases, we don't do it very well at all. But we have this ability to do what's often called a cost-benefit analysis. If we do a certain action, we realize what the cost will be for the future, or what the benefit will be for the future. Okay? So knowing this, getting that in your mind and trying to do science, if you don't follow a scientific method, there are pieces in there that you could say, well, I know if I just tweak this a little bit, the result is going to come out to what I want. Okay? That's not the scientific method. Okay? That is doing experiments with an outcome that's predetermined, which is not science. Okay? So let's look at the scientific method. The first one we already know, we already talked about it, okay? You got to ask a question, okay? So you got to ask something of interest or observe something that's interesting to you, and you have a question about that, okay? So this is kind of the fact-gathering piece of the scientific method. It has to start somewhere, all right? Also, part of that fact-gathering process is doing background research. We'll find out what is already known about your question or about the data that you've already collected. Is there already a theory in place that would explain it? Is there already a law in place that would explain it? Okay? If there is, then there's no reason, unless you think that your results are going to potentially test that theory or test that law, then there's really no reason to do it if it's already been explained through science from someone else's explanation. But let's say it hasn't, and it's new. Okay? So then you would construct a hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is not an educated guess, but rather it's an explanation for a natural phenomena. Okay? So it has to be tested. It has to be testable. Okay? So it's not a question. So if I ask you to write a hypothesis, it should not be in the form of a question. It's in the form of a statement that explains a natural phenomenon. It explains what is the possible explanation for that natural phenomenon. It doesn't mean it has to be right. In fact, 90 to 95% of hypotheses that a researcher creates are wrong. They're not supported. Okay? And it's okay. I mean, we'll talk about scientists and their hypotheses, famous scientists, most famous scientists ever, and their hypotheses and where they were wrong. Okay? We'll talk about that as we progress. But again, you're going to construct that hypothesis. Then you're going to test with an experiment that hypothesis. Okay? That test, okay, will then give you some kind of evidence. The evidence is either going to be in support of your hypothesis or refute your hypothesis. And, this often will be analyzed by analyzing data or analyzing your collection of material, your test experiment. Okay, we'll talk about that analyzing. That is often done with statistics. Okay, with mathematical statistics, which will either tell us if we're right or if we're wrong, or if we can't make a remark because we don't have enough data to make that remark. Okay? Let's say your hypothesis is not supported. Okay? Then it goes back to the drawing board. You can construct a new hypothesis. Okay? And then you can test it again, analyze it again, see what the results are. If your hypothesis is supported, then you can construct a communication that shows that your hypothesis is supported. However, if this communication is supposed to go out to the scientific community, it's wise, and often the only way it's getting out there, is if you have done multiple tests, multiple experiments to test your hypothesis, not just one test. But you're testing it from many different avenues. And this is why we'll talk about this a lot more, but this is why scientists rarely do scientific work by themselves. Because if you're a scientist and you constructed a hypothesis and you own that hypothesis and you created a test for it and it comes out in support of it, and you're like, hey, look, I'm a genius. I'm going to report this. I figured out the answer to this question. But then you have another scientist over here who says, well, did you test it this way? And then you have another scientist over here that says, well, what about an experiment that looks like this? This is why scientists collaborate and they build big groups, is because multiple minds look at things from multiple directions. And they might test things from different avenues. Okay? So then your hypothesis has been tested from multiple perspectives, and it makes it a much more sound hypothesis. Okay, so that's the first lecture. We're going to continue talking about scientific method at the next lecture, and we're going to practice scientific method. Okay, so in class, you're going to see that we have some examples of scientific method. We're going to go through these steps, and we're going to create an experiment. Okay, till next time.